I've gone a pretty long time without running any code, so I think we should try to beeline actually testing this thing inside of our simulator. The first thing we need to do is recognize that inside of our .then right here, this is where we actually want to be able to dispatch an action and say, hey, user is now just signed in. Please do something with this information. So rather than console logging out the user, which we're not actually doing just yet, I'm going to dispatch an action. So inside of here, I'm going to manually dispatch an action. So I'm going to call dispatch and pass it an action. I mean, that's really what we're doing here. So I'm going to give it a type, and I'm just going to hard code this in for right now. We'll fix it up in just a second. Login user success with the payload of the user that was just fetched. So remember, the .then is called with the user model. I'm going to pass it through as the payload property. Now the whole key here, the reason that this whole thing works out is that we are not actually calling dispatch until the request is complete. After the request is complete, we create our action and we manually pass it off to dispatch. The action right here, as you see it right here, it might look, this whole line might look very dissimilar from any of the other action creators we've seen, but trust me, behind the scenes, whenever you return an action, as we do right here, it is getting passed into dispatch in the exactly same fashion. The only difference is that we are manually dispatching ourselves. All right, so I think that we're just about ready to do a test, actually get this thing running inside the simulator. The first thing I want to do is flip over to my auth reducer, and I'm going to add in a console log of action inside of here. Let's just see every action that comes across and say, does this thing actually work or not? How is this thing going? Then the only last thing we have to do is, if you recall, we don't actually have any sign up functionality inside of our application right now. Like, we have not yet implemented that. Try to sign the user in and then create an account for them if it doesn't exist. To make sure that we actually have an account to test with, we can flip over to our authentication console in Firebase. So on the left-hand side, you can just click on auth. And then on the right-hand side, there's an add user button. So we can use this to manually add a user to our project. And we can do that to create a test account for us, essentially. So up at the top, on the right-hand side, I'll click Add User, and I'm going to make a test user with an email of test@test.com and a password of password. Cool, looks good. So that's my test user to run with. Now the very last thing I need to do is I have an action creator called login user. I need to make sure that this actually gets called somewhere in my application. So we've not yet wired this up to our login form. So let's flip over to our login form. We're going to import the login user and then hook it up to that button at the bottom. So first, we will import the login user action creator, and then at the bottom, we will add it to the connect call. So here's login user, and this is getting pretty long right here, so I'm going to do some new lines as well. I think that looks pretty reasonable right there. So I am giving it the action creators of email changed, password changed, and login user. All right, last thing we have to do is find our button and make sure that whenever a user presses this thing, we actually call it, or call our action creator. So I'll say on press this dot on button press dot bind this, and inside of this helper method that we're going to define in just a second is where we will call that action creator. So I'll scroll up a little bit, and then we'll add in the helper method on button press. All right, so now we're going to take the email and password from our props object. Again, doing a little bit of ES6 destructuring here. And then I'll call this .props.login user with the email and the password. Remember that we set up the method signature to login user to expect an object with the email and password properties. So we need to make sure that we pass in an object that has both email and password properties on it. All right, finally, at long last, I think we're ready for a test here. So let's open up our React Native debugger. Here it is. I've already got mine open here. Remember, if you are on iOS, you can open yours up by pressing Command D and then hit Start Remote JS Debugging. If you're on Android, on Windows, you can hit Control M and then hit the same button. Okay, so I think we're about ready here. I'm going to do a refresh to make sure we get all the latest code. you can see that we immediately get some console logs of actions that are flowing into that auth reducer. Now here's the fun part. I'm going to select the email field and I'll hit test@test.com. And very interestingly, in the background, you can see that I'm getting an action in the reducer for every character that I add to the email field. So that's the email changed action in action, I guess you could say. And then I'll enter in password, and there's all my password changed actions. And then finally, log in. And hot dog, after a brief pause, I see an action of type login user success with a payload of W. Now if we expand this and look at W, I know there's a lot of really weird properties on here. Don't sweat it. What really matters is that we have an email of test@test.com and a UID, which is the ID for this very particular user. So this is the user model right here. This is the thing that describes the currently logged in user. So that's it. Everything works. Now, I want to take a brief pause, and I want to say, yes, I know that everything we just went through, especially wiring up the action creator, is really tedious. Like, how are you going to ever remember every last step in here? Do not worry. I absolutely guarantee you, you get used to all this little, tiny little details like dispatch and types and payloads. You really get used to it over time. Okay, so just the more practice you get, the more you're going to internalize all this stuff, and you're going to do fantastic. So let's do one last quick review of how this works, because Redux Thunk is a little bit of a brain bender. By using Redux Thunk, we expand the range of values that we can return from an action creator. So we can now return a function from an action creator. This function, as we see it right here, will automatically be called for us by Redux Thunk, and the first argument to it is going to be the dispatch method. So dispatch right here, it is a method, and it allows us to manually send an action off to all of the reducers in our application. By using this, we can do whatever async action we want, and only after that async action, like say logging a user in, is complete, we can then manually dispatch an action with whatever action we can possibly imagine. So this really is a backdoor into Redux. It gives us a ton of control and power over what is going on inside of our application. Whew. All right, so this is great. Good progress. We're definitely signing our users in now. But now we still need to make sure that we're doing all the extra stuff in our application, like showing a spinner here. We need to be able to stop it. We need to create new accounts for users who don't have one, etc. All that good stuff. Let's start working on that in the next section.